We want to tell you about the United Nations report on that chemical weapons attack on August 21st on the outskirts of Damascus. Our Nick Payton-Walsh is at the United Nations, and just minutes ago we were able to see this report. Nick, I looked through it. Some of the interesting details, of course, first and foremost, is that this UN mission confirmed in their minds and according to their findings the use of sarin gas on August 21st.
Indisputably, in fact, some of the samples and laboratories on the victims of this attack say 85% of them showed that they were exposed to sarin. I should also point out one of the key things at the top of this, the UN Secretary-General, who pretty much has been at pains to not throw himself into this too thoroughly, says at the start he condemns the strongest possible terms the use of chemical weapons and believes this act is a war crime and a grave violation of the 1925 Protocol for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I'm paraphrasing the end there, but stark words there, calling this a war crime. There is no assigning blame in here, but people will be looking through the extensive detail here to see precisely what they can conclude about who may be responsible. And I'm sure many will seize upon the complexity of what seems to have been carried out as being potentially outside of the rebels' domain. It's a 41-page report, Hala. Some of the more shocking details you see. One of the youngest people tested here was aged 7 for the use of sarin against them. And one more chilling thing here, actually, on the night of the attacks, between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, there appears to have been some sort of falling temperature weather pressure system that came in over that area, and where gas would normally float up away from people, this low pressure seems to have kept it down, in the words of the report, making the heavy gas stay close to the ground and penetrate the low levels of buildings and constructions where people were seeking shelter. So the very places where people ran to try and hide, in fact seemed to be where they were killed. Some of these delivery devices being used were carrying potentially as many as 50 litres of toxic gas. Running through further parts of this report to the interesting thing that does stick out, and I'm sure many will look at in the future, is here on page 18, a very specific reference to Cyrillic lettering on some of the delivery devices, the rockets seen here. It shows the letters G, I and Sh from the Cyrillic alphabet as being engraved on one particularly of the weapons used here. Another thing they do go on to say too is they believe they're able to trace from where some of these rockets were fired, and I'm sure many critics of the regime will seize upon a suggestion that, in fact, some of these rockets came from the northwest, where if you're standing in Ghouta, in the eastern suburbs of Damascus, that points to areas where there have been claims many believe the Syrian regime keep their chemical weapons. This is simply extrapolating from exactly what you can see inside the page of this report, Hala, but it's incredibly detailed, quite how much evidence they seem to pull out and present here, Hala.
Right, and as you say there, the description of the munitions used to deliver these chemical weapons, the dimensions, as you mentioned, the Cyrillic lettering as well, saying that surface-to-surface rockets were used, possible provenance from the northwest. Experts are going to look at all of this evidence gathered by the inspectors to try to, because this is not this particular mission's remit, but at least point fingers at who might be responsible.
Well, certainly. That's the job ahead, and Human Rights Watch actually has delivered a report similar in many ways. They didn't have the access the UN inspectors did at all, and certainly not the level of evidence here, but they've done some of the extrapolation, and their previous report did point the finger towards the Syrian regime. There is a complexity here for the regime now to explain in many ways. They are looking here at a system here that's remarkably sophisticated, that appears to have delivered substantial quantities of this gas. And in fact, one diplomatic source we spoke to did make the point, you know, really, do we think the rebels are capable of delivering that much gas simultaneously? And of course, in the days ahead, as Syria has said, it will disclose the entirety of its chemical arsenal if it wishes to join the Convention on Chemical Weapons, which it has done. It will then be left trying to again explain where it was under their version of events rebels managed to obtain this level of sophistication, this level of chemical weaponry to carry out the attack. It's a complicated report for the regime to answer in many ways, Hala.
Right, and some of the other findings, 80 survivors were examined, interviewed, and a majority of them suffered loss of consciousness, all these types of symptoms that you would get from exposure to sarin, and we've seen those absolutely shocking amateur videos in the aftermath of the attack. And by the way, Nick, stand by, because I want to tell our viewers as well that Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in a statement today said this is the most significant confirmed use of chemical weapons against civilians since Saddam Hussein used them in Halabja in 1988. So what happens next now that this report is out, Nick?
Well, it is going to play, obviously, substantially into the ongoing negotiations about a UN resolution here to back up what was agreed in Geneva. There are many who say that the sudden flurry of activity we saw in the past few days between Russia and Syria was perhaps because they knew that many would take what's in this report and suggest that it points the finger of blame towards Damascus for what happened on the 21st of August. Just to recap there, Syria has openly said it will give up its chemical weapons, weapons it didn't actually openly admit it had until very recently, and said that it will do that within the begin the process, certainly, within the 2-month procedure which the UN Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, lays out. That hasn't been fast enough for the US, and they managed to put together a framework in Geneva which suggested that would happen significantly faster. But to back up that Geneva framework, the US wants to see a resolution here at the Security Council. And I understand over the weekend and continuing now, there's a lot of horse trading behind closed doors between France, America and the UK, and the Russians, of course, who have a veto at the Security Council as well, to find a wording which is acceptable. Now, we thought we saw harmony on Saturday in Geneva with the framework being brought out, but that began to crumble quite quickly today. John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, said that he felt it was likely that measures to punish Syria for not adhering to this timetable would come under something called Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which, at its broadest, does suggest that force could potentially be used if those resolutions aren't adhered to. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, quite clear this morning in stating that he didn't believe that was the case at all. And in fact, if you look at the framework, it isn't specific that Chapter 7 is involved in a forthcoming resolution. The Russians against any suggestion of the automatic use of force, but this report will provide pressure. It doesn't deviate from what the US, UK and France have already been saying and say their own intelligence confirms. It certainly, I think, will be used by them to back up what they say they've already claimed. Hala.
Right. It's certainly a question whether or not it will change any minds. I don't think anyone is expecting the report to do that. But your sources at the United Nations, we've discussed this potential deal between Russia and the United States. And, of course, they might disagree on whether or not Syria should be punished militarily if it fails to comply. But the timeline is extremely ambitious. We're talking about neutralizing the chemical weapons stockpile of Syria by the middle of next year. What do your sources say about whether or not they believe this is feasible when they speak to you away from a camera?
I think the simple fact is this is ambitious. Everyone knows it's ambitious. But if you're working on the premise that the Syrian government is entirely in control of all its chemical weapons stockpiles, and that's 1,000 metric tons by pretty much the consensus between Moscow and Washington, that if they're in control of all that, then it shouldn't be too difficult to hand it over, because technically they must be kept in pretty secure, safe places rather than towards the front line or at military outposts during the sort of scattered landscape of Syria's civil war. So I think if you look at that framework in Geneva, it's written pretty much as though both sides accept that Syrian government can get hold of these things relatively quickly. And you have to also bear in mind it's probably likely that Russia has quite good oversight as to what's in Syria's chemical arsenal. So maybe those discussions, the technical discussions in Geneva about how to dispose of this stockpile, were perhaps informed by Russia knowing quite what's at stake here. That may explain the incredibly ambitious timetable for a full declaration. They said a week in Geneva, which technically would expire on Friday if the clock started back when that framework came out, although I am hearing, in fact, it may start when a UN resolution is, in fact, passed here in New York. So that timetable itself flexible, but also bear in mind, Harley, you know, the longer these talks go on about a UN resolution, the closer we get to the deadlines that, in fact, the Chemical Weapons Convention that Syria signed up to just a few days ago, the closer those deadlines, in fact, come towards us anyway, Harley.